On Plugged In, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo makes his first visit to sub-Saharan Africa, promising deeper economic ties with the continent. Is this an American response to China's growing influence in the region? Plus, the devastating swarm of desert locusts ravaging vital farmlands in East Africa and threatening crops as far as the Middle East. On Plugged In, strengthening U.S. ties with Africa. Hello and welcome to Plugged In. I'm Millar Sega, filling in for Greta Van Susteren. In what may be a signal of the African continent's growing strategic importance to the world, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo recently concluded a high-profile visit to 3 African countries. To Senegal in West Africa to discuss the growing threat from extremist violence, then south to oil-rich Angola to talk about anti-corruption efforts there, and concluding in Ethiopia, a key security ally to help shore up that country's efforts to combat terrorism. But as VOA's State Department correspondent Cindy Sain tells us, the Secretary's visit was also about the competition.
Meeting with entrepreneurs was a priority for Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on his recent visits to Senegal, Angola, and Ethiopia. His message, the U.S. is open for business with Africa. But he also warned of doing business with authoritarian countries, a veiled swipe at China.
They breed corruption, dependency. They don't hire the local people. They don't train. They don't lead them. They run the risk that the prosperity and sovereignty and progress that Africa so needs and desperately wants won't happen.
China has been the leading trading and business partner for Africa for a decade now, and the U.S. is lagging behind, experts tell VOA.
Again, I think China has a longer game. It has a clearer plan for what it wants to do with its economic influence around the world, and America is consumed with a lot of its own issues at home.
We're by far the largest provider of humanitarian aid to the continent. We do a lot of military engagements, joint exercises, counterterrorism operations, all of which are very welcomed by African states. So I don't want to say we don't have any influence, but China has had a strategy for decades that it has been very disciplined about pursuing and executing, and it's bearing fruit.
But other experts say a visit by the chief American diplomat sends a strong signal that the U.S. values Africa as an important business and strategic security partner.
We had an American official on the continent, and it wasn't because of a health crisis or because of war or because all of the negative stereotypical stories that come out of the continent.
More added, Pompeo's trip should be followed up by more regular visits by top U.S. officials, noting that China's foreign minister visits Africa every year.
So did Secretary Pompeo accomplish what he set out to do, or is the administration simply trying to catch up with the Chinese government's expanding influence there? Correspondent Cindy Sain covers the State Department for VOA. She traveled with the Secretary, and she joins me now on the set. Welcome to Plugged In. It's so good to see you here. Listen, obviously the message from the State Secretary was the U.S. is open for business. But clearly there was also an underlying message, beware of the competition. Is that about right?
That is exactly right, Mill. And the Secretary, of course, told the African leaders that he met with, you can choose to do business with whomever you please, sure. But he tried to offer the U.S. as an alternative. He gave a major speech in Addis about liberating Africa's entrepreneurs. And he said, socialism hasn't worked, centralized planning hasn't worked. He said what works is property rights, the rule of law, giving women opportunities. And he made a point in all 3 of the countries in meeting with women entrepreneurs, women who had coffee businesses, internet businesses. He highlighted a woman who had started Ethiopia's Uber called Ride, and he and his wife Susan, who had accompanied him on the trip, were obviously visibly impressed by some of these young people and the women entrepreneurs that they met with.
So does a pro-business message resonate with the African people, the people in those countries that he visited?
It seemed to resonate from what I could tell. You could tell there was genuine interactions. It seemed that the leaders were very happy to see him. The Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy took him for a little spin in his car. So there was some personal fun and some personal interaction there. And it seemed to be a visit in Senegal. The secretary got to preside over the signing of 5 big memorandum of understanding, building a hospital burn center, building a major highway. So it seemed to be a very good and productive visit.
This is really about building bridges, but this is the State Secretary Pompeo's first visit to Africa as the secretary, as a cabinet member. The question I have is, why now? Why at this moment are we sort of paying attention to Africa all of a sudden?
Right, and that's a very good question, Mill. I'm not sure if I can answer it, but the secretary, his message about warning of the dangers of China, which you alluded to at the beginning, is a consistent one for him. He has also warned European allies. He's warned American governors about China, saying, you know, China has a list of all of you, saying how favorable you are to business with them. And the U.S. Message there is, beware, American businesses are transparent, whereas they point to what they would say is the kind of a debt trap a lot of times with China, and also China, you know, not being as transparent and not being as upfront about. And also he said that the American companies will hire African workers. And of course some of the leaders he met with said that is still our major problem, is youth unemployment.
What is China doing there that the U.S. is not? Clearly, in your piece, you said they have a longer-term strategy, don't they?
They do have a longer-term strategy, and if he needed to be reminded, then when he landed in Ethiopia, the airport there was expanded partially by Chinese funds. The UN building there he visited was funded by Chinese. Probably some of the roads that we were on were funded by China. So the examples are everywhere that China is ahead. And some would say that the U.S., you asked about the timing, is a bit late to the party.
And that's what's interesting about this. You can drive over infrastructure, you can touch rail stations. It's harder to touch democracy in action, isn't it? I mean, is that sort of where we're at a disadvantage, the United States?
That's right, Mill, but that was one of the Secretary's messages. He was saying he picked these 3 countries in particular because their peoples are demanding reform and their leaders are responding. As you said, in Angola, you know, turning away from some of the corruption of past leaders and taking bold measures against that. Ethiopia, you know, the Prime Minister there just having won the Nobel Peace Prize. So there's a lot happening, and the Secretary said, look, we have shared values. You know, we value democracy. We value transparency, equality for women, property rights, and entrepreneurship. And look at us as an alternative.
Thank you so much for covering this issue for us. Cindy Sain, our VOA State Department correspondent. Well, the Secretary's visit comes as America's international dominance is being challenged by massive Chinese infrastructure investments in the continent. But that's just one of the many challenges in that part of the world. Plugged In's Greta Van Susteren explains.
Running above the Ethiopian capital, this new rail system helps to avoid the choking traffic below. In Kenya, the Madaraka Express is a new passenger rail system linking Mombasa to Nairobi and other cities to the west. These 2 projects, funded by China's massive Belt and Road Initiative, are now challenging America's influence in Africa.
At the moment, there's a lot of focus on infrastructure, and particularly transport, pipelines, that sort of thing, which don't directly address poverty. And in fact, there's been, in some cases, some controversy about the social and environmental impacts. But I think the aim should be to address development, including poverty and related issues.
Meeting with African leaders, Secretary Pompeo's visit was less about infrastructure and more about improving U.S. relations with African partners by providing military training and reducing America's military footprint in the region.
We're not going to totally withdraw forces from Africa. Economy of force doesn't mean complete withdrawal from any continent, and we do economy force in various locations, and it's an important distinction to make.
But nature had other plans, complicating the Secretary's visit, a storm of locusts. Many countries in East Africa are in the midst of the worst locust infestation in generations, threatening crops and the region's economy.
And that was VOA contributor Greta Van Susteren. Now, given the multiple challenges facing the continent, what do African countries really want and need from the United States? For more on the African perspective, we are joined by VOA English to Africa's television managing editor, Vincent McCory. Vincent is also a respected journalist and longtime host of VOA's Africa 54. So good to have you on, Vincent.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So the African continent getting enormous attention, not just from China and the U.S., but also from the rest of the world. What can you tell us? Why the interest? Is there something about these 54 countries that we don't know anything about?
Well, there's a lot about the continent now that makes Russia, Turkey, the European countries, and China and the U.S. want to go to Africa. First, we have a vibrant young population, which gives promise for the future. There's a big market. You know, sometimes people forget that Africa as a continent has got a population of over 1.4 billion people.
That's right.
And that is a huge market for anybody who wants to do business. The continent also has potential to be a kind of a place where, you know, you can set up business and have reasonable, cheap labor, along with, of course, a good, healthy market. And also at the same time, it is becoming business friendly. If you look at some of the countries that are becoming stable and becoming very progressive at the moment.
It represents huge potential. We saw in the 90s China's rise as a superpower. Is Africa on sort of that same trajectory with 1.4 billion people and all these vibrant, rich economies?
I mean, there's a lot that is happening. More could happen, but mostly it's the potential that people are seeing in this in the continent of Africa, and that is why they want to invest. They want to go in quickly. China has seen that potential wants to make sure it is first, and it's building an infrastructure and the foundation that will guarantee that it reaps all the benefits. Remember, it is a country that is awash with minerals. It has oil, diamond, gold, and anything you can think of. So if you are forward-looking, you can see that in the coming several years, that is the next place to be. That is the continent of the future.
As you say, China recognized its potential a decade ago.
Yeah.
What is what is China doing that the U.S. is not? Because we're finding it kind of hard to compete with that sort of established framework that China has already set up.
Yeah. Well, the U.S. says it's doing a lot of things, and indeed it does do a lot of things on the ground.
Right.
But it's a question of visibility and also perception of the African people. China has invested a lot in doing this massive, shiny infrastructure. They're constructing road networks, railways, bridges. And these are things that bring immediate benefits to the people. People on the continent can see themselves taking their goods to the farms, to the markets quickly. Their trips have been cut by half because of Chinese infrastructure. They see that. They don't see the U.S. constructing roads and railway lines and bridges. You see, so there is that visibility in terms of what they're doing and the immediate benefits that they're deriving from those massive infrastructure developments.
Are these people who live in these African countries where China is investing massively, though, are they actually benefiting from these things? I understand from the Secretary that some of them are not being trained properly, some of them are not being paid as much as they should. What's going on?
Many Africans are realizing that they're not really benefiting as much from the Chinese infrastructure engagements in Africa. This is mostly kind of optically benefiting the leaders. At the top, they can claim that they have taken their countries from point A to point B in terms of development of the roads and the cities. But in terms of the actual benefits, the citizens of these countries are really not getting the benefit. They don't get employed by those Chinese farms. They don't get to see, they don't get to earn from a lot of the work that is happening on the continent, because the Chinese bring their own people to the continent. And so most of the money really stays back in China.
You know what I hear from Western analysts all the time is that China's policies tend to be predatory. But do Africans see themselves as prey, or do they see themselves as beneficiaries of all of this interest from around the world?
Slowly, initially they thought they were beneficiaries because a great number of people did not understand the terms of the loans that they were getting from China. In fact, some people thought this was like some kind of foreign aid. But now they're realizing with the terms of the loans and the Chinese practices of implementing this project that they're actually not benefiting as much as they thought. So it's a slow realization. But of course, the big projects are visible. And that is where you can say the U.S. is not doing things in such a visible way that African people see the presence of the U.S. on the ground.
These 54 African countries got a lot going for them, right? But, but there's also some serious ecological and environmental challenges that they are currently facing, particularly in the Horn of Africa.
Yes.
What can you tell us about the locust scourge that's going on there?
These locusts are such a threat to the eastern part of Africa because we're talking about swarms of locusts that are the size of cities, as big as New York, that are sweeping across those countries, eating per day up to 1.8 metric tons of vegetation. This is a major threat to a region that is already reeling from a drought for many, many months that has actually threatened up to 25 million people with a drought, and not only drought, but famine. So in the coming months, you can expect so much worse.
Hopefully we see some help coming their way fairly soon. Vincent McCory, thank you so much. English to Africa, managing editor and host of VOA's Africa 54. Well, as you've heard, there's a lot going on in the continent, especially in East Africa, parts of which are now suffering through the worst locust infestation in 70 years. It is indeed a plague of biblical proportions. As many as 360 billion hungry locusts devouring crops in vital farmlands in a region already suffering from hunger. This Kenyan farmer was expecting a bumper crop until he woke up one morning to find a storm of locusts outside.
They feasted on the maize, green grams. They even ate watermelons. They also ate what was meant for our cows and goats.
And there is little these farmers can do. In the neighboring Otuke district in northeast Uganda, 2,000 troops armed with pesticides were deployed to fight the locusts. But without aerial support, Major General Sam Kavunga says it's a losing battle.
And when we kill them while during the spray, then they jump and go on top of the trees where our pumps cannot reach.
The locust invasion is the worst in decades. Some countries like Kenya have not seen anything like this in more than 70 years. And unless something is done soon, the long-term consequences could be devastating.
If this is not dealt quickly and timely, this will have an effect, a really serious effect on the food security of the region.
The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has asked the international community for $138 million in immediate aid. It has raised about $69 million so far.
These figures do go up over time. The locusts are not waiting, of course, for the international community to respond. They're continuing to breed and increase in number in the three main affected countries.
Early estimates suggest as many as 30 million people are in need of urgent food relief. Right now, helpless farmers say all they can do is watch.
All the leaves are gone. Even the fruits that I was expecting to harvest now, they are all down.
Scientists say warm weather and heavy rains have triggered massive locust breeding grounds in Djibouti, Eritrea, and Sudan. And if conditions continue, experts say their eggs can hatch in as little as 2 weeks.
What it means is that if eggs are laid and successfully hatch, then we are going into another generation, and that generation will have multiplied up to 4 or 5 times.
It's a frightening prospect for nearly a dozen countries directly in the path of billions of hungry insects, from as far south as Tanzania to Iran and Pakistan in the north and as far east as India. So just how urgent is the current locust infestation, and why does it matter in countries far from the locust breeding sites? Well, there are few people who know more about desert locusts than my next guest. Keith Kretzmann is a senior locust forecasting officer at the UN's Food and Agriculture Administration. He heads the Desert Locust Information Service, which analyzes global weather patterns and ecological conditions to predict where those locust swarms will be. He's also in charge of technical assistance and training to member countries on how to plan and fight those locust infestations. Mr. Kretzmann joins us from FAO headquarters in Rome, Italy. Welcome to Plugged In, sir. How much warning?
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
How much warning, Keith Kretzmann, did the FAO have that a locust invasion of this size was actually forming and coming to the region?
Well, we've been monitoring the situation since the first instances in mid-2018 of two cyclones that reached the Arabian Peninsula and brought very heavy rains at that time. And this has allowed, of course, the locust to increase tremendously, about 8,000-fold in about 9 months. And during last year, in 2019, of course, the locust swarms, they formed in the Arabian Peninsula, and then they moved north into Iran, and then on to India and Pakistan, and they moved south into Yemen, and then to the Horn of Africa. So, you know, the situation was building up in the past year and a half. We were monitoring it very carefully. The countries that were affected at that time were undertaking the necessary control operations. More than 2 million hectares were treated, of course, of locust infestations. The problem was that in December of 2019, there was an unexpected cyclone that came in off the Indian Ocean to the Horn of Africa. And this is what really tipped the situation that was under control for the most part into what we now face as a very dangerous situation with unprecedented threats to food security and livelihoods.
I was going to ask you about the food security situation, because clearly many of those countries that are affected by these plagues are already underperforming on the Global Food Insecurity Index. What is the impact on growing conditions and the potential for more hunger down the road?
Well, of course, we have to realize where these infestations are present. And they're in a corner of Africa that's already extremely vulnerable, very fragile, because they faced a number of years of droughts. And now this year they've had heavy rains and floods. On top of that, they have the locusts. And so this is just not another problem that they need to face. Countries like Ethiopia, 80% of the population relies on agriculture. 75% of the people in Kenya rely on agriculture. And as you've heard, locusts are very voracious. A square kilometer of swarm, for example, can eat the same amount of food in one day as 35,000 people. Wow. I'm sitting here in Rome, Italy. Imagine a swarm the size of Rome can eat in one day the same amount of food as all of Kenya. So the impacts can be tremendous. But it's the timing that's very important. So at the moment now in Kenya and in Ethiopia and Somalia, it's that new generation of locusts that are starting to form swarms. And this coincides with the planting season and the upcoming long rains season in that part of the world.
Right. So now the FAO is requesting $138 million in urgent international aid. What is that money going to be used for?
Yes, about half of that money goes to actual control operations. So this is the upscaling of the necessary aerial control operations, which are required due to the scale, the magnitude of the current problem. The other half actually goes to protecting livelihoods. Those people who rely on agriculture, that rely on grazing animals for their livelihoods. And then a portion of that money as well goes to rehabilitation. Of course, those farmers and those pastoralists that have already been hit very hard by the locusts. But it's interesting to note, of course, that the initial appeal from FAO in early January was about $76 million. And now, a month later, that has increased to $138 million. So this shows you, as time goes on, and the problem just gets bigger, because the locusts continue to multiply and breed as long as the weather is favorable.
What is your current forecast right now? Will this situation get worse before it gets better? What do you see happening down the pipeline?
Yes, for sure. We are anticipating it will get worse before it does get better, especially in the next few months as that new generation forms swarms. Because it's at the beginning of the rainy season, it means that the conditions should be favorable for another generation of breeding in northern Kenya, southern Ethiopia, adjacent areas of Somalia. This will result in an additional 20-fold increase in locust infestations. But by about June, of course, the conditions will start to dry out, early part of the summer, and those locusts, then they will move. And they're most likely to move in a northerly direction. So those in Kenya will reinvade Ethiopia, reinvade Somalia. They will move all the way through Ethiopia up into Sudan. They will also move to the corner of the Horn of Africa. And from there, they can migrate directly from northeastern Somalia across the Indian Ocean to India and Pakistan.
Keith Kretzmann, I have less than a minute left, but is there any good news that you can tell us in the horizon?
Well, we are getting a good response to the appeal. Of course, we still do have gaps, which we hope to plug very quickly, but the responses are turning into action in the field. So we need to continue this, and of course, we need to upscale it very, very quickly in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you so much. Keith Kretzmann, FAO's Senior Locust Forecaster. Well, before we go, an update for you on the global coronavirus crisis, officially named COVID-19. The virus has infected nearly 120,000 people and killed more than 4,000 around the world. Here in Washington, at least 5 lawmakers are under self-quarantine after coming in contact with a person diagnosed with the virus. And in New York, the National Guard was called in to enforce containment in one suburb with one of the nation's biggest coronavirus clusters. More from VOA's Julie Tabo on how one American community is dealing with the outbreak.
The first deaths from the coronavirus in the U.S. took place at the Life Care Center, a nursing home in Kirkland, Washington, in late February. So far, more than 20 people have died in the state, the great majority of them residents from the Kirkland facility. It has been a heart-wrenching time for Vanessa Phelps, whose 90-year-old mother is a resident of the Life Care Center. She hasn't been able to see her since the center went into lockdown.
So she's feeling claustrophobic, depressed, stressed. This past week, she's felt the stress of the staff and me not being able to visit her.
That's the kind of scenario health experts are worried about. As the number of cases continue to rise, experts are increasingly concerned about the spread of COVID-19 in elder care facilities across the country.
It is a concern, and I think the experience out in Washington State has been enlightening, that this virus is deadly for the elderly and those with impaired immune systems. So in those type of facilities where there are clustered groups of elderly, they need to work really hard to keep the virus out of their facility.
The situation in Washington State is tragic. An outbreak in a long-term care facility is one of the things we have been worried about from day one.
Part of the concern is the general shortage of coronavirus test kits. So residents in elder care facilities are being quarantined while they wait, which is causing anxiety and uncertainty for family members like Phelps.
If emergencies happen like this, you should be prepared. Separate the people that have it and don't have it. Test everybody. I've been tested twice in a 7-day period, yet my mom hasn't been tested once. Unacceptable.
Health experts say they are working on that and providing guidelines to facilities across the country should the virus strike.
If a resident becomes sick in a nursing home with what's called an influenza-like illness, which is fever, sometimes cough, shortness of breath, other signs like that, the staff know that person needs not only appropriate clinical evaluation and care, but also precautions to prevent the spread to other residents.
Staff and visitors are also being told to self-quarantine for 2 weeks if they think they've been exposed to the virus.
That is our show this week. Stay safe, everyone. I'm Millar Sega. Thank you for being plugged in.